Welcome to another Zeteo Town Hall. I am Mehdi Hassan here in Washington, D.C., and I'm joined today by two very important guests. You all know what is happening in Gaza, but we only know what is happening in Gaza through the Palestinian journalists who've been giving their lives trying to report from Gaza, but they are constantly defamed and smeared by supporters of Israel in the West. But we also know about what's happening in Gaza thanks to brave Western doctors who have gone out to volunteer in Gaza from all across the world, but especially places like the UK, the US, Canada, Australia. And today we're joined by two doctors who have just returned from Gaza, from Nasser Hospital, Gaza, have seen the starvation and famine firsthand, have seen the violence firsthand, have seen the victims at those quote unquote GHF aid sites. Dr. Sleemi is a urogynecologist. She is the co-founder and surgical director of International Medical Response. And Dr. Nick Maynard is a British doctor, consultant surgeon at Oxford University Hospitals. Thank you both for joining us today on Zeteo. Nick, I'm going to start with you because I believe you've been going to Gaza for 15 years. This was not your first rodeo, if I can use that phrase, or first genocide. You covered a lot of those conflicts, 2014, 2012, the fallout from 2009, all of those Israeli assaults that pale into comparison with this one. But I want to get it from you as someone who's seen Gaza before, seen it suffer in the past. When you went this time, how shocking was it to you? How was it different? How was it worse this time?
It was indescribably worse. And as I've been to Gaza many times, as you say, and each time I go, I think I'm going to be ready for what I'm going to see. And that particularly applies for the three trips I've had since October the 7th, 2023. And each time I think, well, I know Gaza well, I'm going to be ready for this. I've been speaking to friends and colleagues I know, but each time I get there, it's much worse. And this occasion, much more so. I really thought I'd be ready because I've had two trips out there in a year ago, in the last year. I've seen terrible things out there and I thought I'd be ready, but this time it was so much worse. And I don't think anyone can be prepared for the things you see in Gaza now.
Well, we're going to talk more about that. Sadly, we have to. We have to document this stuff and make sure people know what is going on because there is so much misinformation and disinformation. To those of you who are joining Zeteo subscribers, thank you for your support. Thank you for coming today. I know there's already nearly 150 of you in the chat. That number's going up. We've got a Q&A. If you click on the Q&A button, you can post your questions for doctors Nick Maynard and Sleemi. We will come to your questions in a moment. I'm going to chat to them for the next 15, 20 minutes, and then I'm going to start reading out some of your questions. Obviously, I won't be able to get through all of them, but please put your questions in the chat, and we'll try and get through as many as we can. Let me ask you this. I believe this was your first trip to Gaza. Nick talks about it being indescribable in comparison to previous trips. What was it like for you the first day, the first hour, the first moment you step into Nasser Hospital?
Yeah, thanks for having me. Yeah, it was my first time, and I have spent my last, 20 years of my career working in either conflict zones or intra-conflict zones, ceasefire zones, or post-conflict. And I felt like I had been trying to follow the news and follow the medical condition on the ground in Gaza since the beginning of the genocide. And I really was not prepared for what I saw. I think my first 2 hours in Nasser were shocking, to say the least. And again, I was completely unprepared for the situation on the ground with the conditions of the patients that we saw, with the conditions of the healthcare workers that we were working with, and also just Nasser Hospital as a facility. As we know, a year and a half ago, it was invaded by the Israeli military and ransacked. And so I knew a little bit about the history, but there were telltale signs of it all over the hospital between, gunshot wounds in the walls, outside, inside, markings made, electronic equipment that had been destroyed completely. So that was in the first, few hours of me going in.
And when we talk about hunger in Gaza, because the story, the story for the first, I don't know how to describe it. The first year and a half was about the killing, right? About the sheer number of people being killed by Israeli bombs and bullets. The story in recent weeks, at least which has penetrated finally into Western consciousness, into political media elites, is starvation, is hunger. It's finally forced at least maybe not the American leader, but European leaders off the fence to say this is wrong, this needs to stop. Ambreen, when we talk about starvation and hunger and malnutrition and malnourishment, you mentioned the staff. Before we get to, and Nick, I want to talk to you about some of the people you treated. The people you're working with, Ambreen, the doctors, the nurses who are still there, still alive, what's their situation? I'm assuming they themselves are struggling from this, the lack of food and resource.
Yeah, of course. The lack of food became obvious. And in the almost month that I was there, you could see it steadily getting worse. We saw it in our patients, we saw it in our staff, everyone from the doctors, the head of departments. I spent a lot of time in the maternity hospital and also the evenings in the general operating rooms. And you could tell that between the dehydration and malnourishment, starvation, how it was affecting our staff also in the energy levels, in pictures that they showed us from what they looked like even a year earlier to what they looked like there. I mean, there was a visible loss of weight, visible bones, and just an overall fatigue. That was definitely noticed. And people they talked about how hungry they were every morning when we saw them. I mean, it was a conversation that everybody was having. So it was incredibly prevalent among the staff and also obviously among our patients.
And just to hear you talk about that as someone who's literally just come back weeks ago is astonishing, because we are hearing in the pro-Israeli parts of the Western media that this is all a fiction. This is all manufactured. This is Hamas propaganda. Nick, you wrote in The Guardian recently, every day I watch patients deteriorate and die, not from their injuries, but because they are too malnourished to survive surgery. Talk to me about what you saw in terms of malnourishment, in terms of actual kids wasting away. Because again, I know you've seen this controversy we had in the US where the New York Times published an image of a child and we were told, oh, wait, that's a fake image because the child had a pre-existing condition, as if that somehow makes it okay. But talk to me about the people you saw who had no pre-existing conditions, who were simply suffering from malnutrition and starvation.
It was terrible. I mean, we saw malnutrition a year ago. I've no idea why it's taken this long for this to come out. It's certainly worse now, but it was appalling a year ago. I had patients dying a year ago of malnutrition in Gaza, but this time it's even worse than I could have imagined. They're coming in profoundly malnourished, very, very thin. When they're malnourished, their immune system is suppressed. They don't heal. Their tissues don't repair. They come in with these terrible injuries. We do. I was operating every day on major abdominal injuries, major thoracic injuries, dealing with either terrible shrapnel injuries from the fragmentation bombs and these minute little pieces of shrapnel which tear through all the internal organs, or very bad gunshot wounds. And the internal damage is horrific. We operate to repair all these tissues, but because they're so malnourished, the tissues don't heal, and many of the repairs that we do break down. So they get leakages of various bodily fluids into their abdomen, and they get terrible infections. And not only are they terribly malnourished when they come in and get all these terrible complications, we have no nutrition to give them in the hospital. In the adults, we had no nutrition to give them. If their families could get some, they'd bring it in for them. If they couldn't, they didn't get nutrition. And many of these people can't eat, so you have to give them liquid nutrition, and that was, for adults, simply not there. So they then got more and more malnourished, and consequently, many of them died. And and so many of them are preventable deaths. Yeah. It was really very distressing to see.
Ambreen, Deborah Derendinger, sorry if I've mispronounced your name, Deborah, in the chat asks, how do you take care of your own physical needs while in Gaza?
How do we take care of our own? Is that what the question
was? Yes, while you're out there, how do you look after yourself while you're in a place like that? Deborah's wondering.
Oh, well, I mean, I feel like we were committed to trying to help our colleagues do the best job they could. I think we lived in the hospital. And so I think even though hospitals are not 100% safe in Gaza, nowhere is safe. Our colleagues had to leave and go to their tents on public buses because nobody has fuel for cars. And if you had a car, it was likely it was bombed or destroyed in some sort of fashion. So I mean, for us, at least we had a place that we all lived together. And again, it was on the hospital complex. So how safe that is, nothing is 100% safe, but compared to our healthcare worker colleagues and our patients who had to, leave every day on buses through a safe route, and then go try to find food for their families. I feel like that was really the main issue that we were contending with. I mean, feel like
And
we were, I don't
yeah,
know.
and Umbreen, Faisal Bhatti asks, did you encounter Israeli soldiers when you entered Gaza? What was that like at the checkpoints in terms of getting in there? What was that like for you, he wonders?
Oh, so that was my first time crossing the checkpoint, and it was very tense and very stressful. The entire exchange of uh, going from convoy to armored vehicles once you're in Gaza was I've only experienced it once before in South Sudan, but this time it was with armed guards with machine guns kind of pointed at us as we take our luggage across this parking lot. I mean, you start off in this incredibly tense situation, and then from there you're taken in these convoys, to the UN headquarters, where then you're picked up by your host in Gaza, and that'll take you to a little guest house, safe house for the night before we go to the hospital. But it was very tense. Everything from the start of it all was very tense. And we're just kind of, everybody is a little bit on edge because of the situation. And once you enter Gaza, you really hear the constant drones that everybody has talked about 24/7, and then gunshot wounds, or gunshots rather, from quadcopters. And then outside the hospital, when we got there, it was declared, at least for my first few days there, I think Nick, you got there before I did, but it was declared a red zone, and there were tanks on the streets just right outside of hospital grounds, and there was bombing and shooting very close to the hospital 24/7 for those very tense days when I first got there.
Nick, I've heard Israeli military propagandists' online social accounts say it's all a lie that we're blocking things from going in. They have everything they need. I've seen people deny the infant formula was banned from going into Gaza. You went into Gaza. I think I saw you say somewhere that things were stopped. Explain to people watching today what was stopped from going in when you went in.
So we all had our luggage search. We were given pretty strict instructions by Matt, the NGO we went in with, not to take anything they were likely to confiscate from us. Colleagues of mine took in some baby formula about a week after I had gone in, because we'd sent messages out saying we need baby formula. We've got babies literally dying. There were 4 newborns died the week before I got there because there was no formula feed. And some American doctors I knew who were out there when they arrived about 3 days after me, had all brought in formula feed in their luggage, and they had all had it removed from their luggage by the Israeli border guards and taken away. And very specifically the formula feed, nothing else. That's all they took out of their luggage. And every single container of formula feed was taken away. And
have you ever witnessed or experienced anything like that in your career of going around the world and trying to save people?
No, and that's why I say each time I go back to Gaza, it's indescribably worse. And there are things that one could not imagine happening at the moment in Gaza, and that's why you can't be prepared for it. And we had babies. I mean, little baby Zainab, I will remember very well, a 7-month-old little girl who looked a newborn. She was being fed with 10% dextrose when I first visited the pediatric intensive care. That's sugar water, no formula feed, and she died 2 weeks into our trip there. And there are many stories that both Amberine and I can talk about. So that was, this notion that Israel had denied this, we've witnessed them taking these things out of luggage. So there is no question they are the ones responsible for stopping this feed getting in there.
No question, indeed. Indescribably evil, in my view. Umbreen, last week, Medical Aid for Palestine, which is the group Nick just mentioned, reported that nearly half of pregnant and breastfeeding mothers in Gaza are suffering from severe malnutrition. You, of course, worked in the maternity ward during your time at Al Nasser. What is the impact of that on women and children? I know the one of the UN special rapporteurs has just come out recently and said there is a genocide in Gaza. It's a genocide specifically targeting women and children. Talk a bit about that.
Right. So I did spend my mornings and most of my time in the maternity hospital. So taking care of pregnant women who came in, we could clearly see that they were malnourished. And pregnancy is a time where nourishment and fetal development are vital. So not only do you have to have a healthy mom taking the nutrients necessary to prevent babies that won't thrive, babies with birth defects like spina bifida, they're very specific nutrients that we know and we give everywhere else in the world. Women who get pregnant are instructed to take vitamins specifically to maintain a healthy pregnancy, to give birth to a healthy baby. And what we saw was that women came in malnourished. Malnourished women give birth to malnourished babies. The rate of miscarriages and abortions at that point was up 300%. The rate of birth defects had increased markedly. And part of that is malnutrition, but part of it is that with the constant bombing and munitions that are in the air, in the soil, in the sea, that are heavy metals and toxins that are taken in while embryogenesis is happening. So that could be one of the main reasons. Preterm birth, preterm delivery is a consequence of both stress and malnutrition, and we saw both of that. So the overall holistic picture from a maternity point of view was very, very grim, and that translates to an absolutely, terrible consequences for babies that are born, full term that don't look full term, for babies that are born preterm that can't get the nutrients that they need. And as far as the femigenocide, this was from the UN Rapporteur on Women and Girls. And 67% of fatalities that are documented in Gaza are women and children. 67%.
It's just a horrific number. But apparently they're all Hamas, is what we're told. Let me ask you this, Nick. You, I believe, have described elsewhere, but just for our subscribers who are watching, you described a scene involving a quadcopter attacking women who were feeding their children. Can you talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, I just did. I didn't see that scene. I operated on the women who'd been attacked. So I saw one of the most stark differences about this trip, other than the malnutrition, was the large number of gunshot wounds that we saw. I'd seen quadcopter wounds on previous trips, but they were in a minority. This time we saw lots of teenage boys who were shot at the Gazan Humanitarian Foundation food sites, but there were also shootings by quadcopters on the tents very close to those sites. So I had two ladies who came in who'd both been shot by quadcopters. They were in the tents. One of them was breastfeeding her 7-month-old baby. The other one was pregnant, just resting. And the quadcopters, and they did this frequently, were indiscriminately firing rounds at all the tents, trying to kill whoever was in them. And these ladies were brought into the hospital. I operated on both of them. The pregnant lady had terrible damage to her bowel. Miraculously, the bullets had missed her uterus and the baby was fine.
Wow.
But I had to remove quite a bit of her bowel. The other lady who was breastfeeding, again, had terrible bowel damage from these gunshot wounds. And these were quadcopters that were firing indiscriminately at the tents where there would be almost exclusively women and children in them.
So in a sense, it's not that indiscriminate. You could argue it was discriminate.
Well,
They were actually,
yeah.
They knew exactly what they were doing. You also mentioned, Nick, describe what happened in terms of, you've talked about target practice. You've talked about what you believe looks like a pattern of shootings at different body parts. Explain what you mean by that and what you saw and some of the examples.
So I think it was my third or fourth day after I'd arrived, and a young 12-year-old came in having been shot, and we knew he'd been shot at one of the food distribution points, one of the GHF food distribution points. And he died on the operating table, this 12-year-old boy, because the bullet had severed his aorta, and we couldn't save his life. And we were talking about them, and then we had another 2 or 3 bullet wounds in the abdomen that came in the same day. And I was talking to a close friend of mine who's a Gazan ER doctor who I've worked with on previous trips, and he said they had noticed a very strong pattern over the preceding weeks, and we then noticed that very striking pattern over the next 2 to 3 weeks, whereby there were clusters of particular body parts being injured on particular days. Now, these were all young teenage boys ranging from 11 to 15, 16. And one day they would be coming in predominantly with gunshot wounds to the head or the neck. Most of them died, clearly. The next day there'd be gunshot wounds to the chest. The next day there'd be the abdomen. The next day the legs or the arms. And one day, which was at the end of my third week on the Saturday evening, 4 young teenage boys, 13, 14, came in, all of whom had been shot in the testicles. Now, this clustering of injuries was so striking. The numbers on some days were so great, it was inconceivable that it could have been coincidence. And it appeared to us like there was a game of target practice being played.
Right. So Israeli soldiers at the GHF site seemed to be shooting kids in the testicles because that was the day they decided to target. These are sharpshooters who presumably can hit any body part they want.
Absolutely. Now, and the stories, we interrogated the relatives of the victims, some of the victims themselves, and some of our Gazan healthcare colleagues used to go to these food distribution points to get food for their own starving families and witness these, and they all described the same thing. These were kids were being shot by Israeli soldiers, sometimes by quadcopters, but predominantly Israeli soldiers. And absolutely, with their weaponry, they could target these specific body parts. And it was exactly as we described. Today, it's going to be the head. Tomorrow, the chest. Saturday, it's going to be the testicles.
I just don't know how to respond to this. I've covered a lot of things in my career as a journalist, but these are some of the most horrific things I've ever heard or seen about. Umbreen, to bring you back into the conversation and bring in some of our subscribers, we've got a couple of hundred people watching right now. Thank you for joining us. A lot of questions in the chat. Cynthia Farah and Mary Scott both ask a similar question. Mary asks, if we got a permanent ceasefire, what would the steps be to get significant medical care on the ground and then build new healthcare infrastructure? And Cynthia asks something similar, which is, besides opening the borders and getting in food and aid, can hospitals be rebuilt to take care of Palestinians in Gaza? And I just wonder, again, the short term, the long term, from what you saw, and you've been to Ukraine and Haiti and other places, I believe, how bad is the healthcare situation? Can it be saved? Can those healthcare facilities be saved in the short term, at least?
Well, I don't know the exact percentage of hospitals that have been rendered unusable at this point. But for Nasser, it was still functioning, but it needed a lot of just rehabilitation of the building itself, but also supplies. And I think it is true that if there was a permanent ceasefire, an end to the blockade, and ultimately an end to the occupation, Gaza could rebuild, but it would take a very, very long time.
Yeah.
But we have to look at the systematic dismantling of the healthcare system, which starts with, yes, the buildings are one thing, supplies are another, but staff. I mean, we've had, I think, over 1,000, I'm not sure, Nick, if you know the number, more than 1,000 healthcare workers that have been targeted and killed.
Yes. Over 1,500 now.
Yeah, over 1,500. Even while we were there, one of the top surgeons was killed by a bomb dropping on their tent. A few days when I got there, an OBGYN that my department that I was working with knew very well was also killed by a bomb. This goes to not only physicians, but nurses, scrub techs, OR techs, from top to bottom. And so it's also staff. But also one thing I wanted to point out that we just learned from the UN agencies that coordinate aid going in and people going in, like Nick and myself, that this week there has been almost zero new volunteer doctors let into Gaza. And normally twice a week, plus or minus, there will be a new crew like Nick and myself and other of our colleagues that will come in to, help with either expertise, help with, extra set of hands. But this week we just learned that at this point, they've been denied. So that's unusual.
It just gets worse, unusually worse. Also, while I've got you, Umbreen, Margaret Hayden, you mentioned earlier about the effects of the heavy metals on children and on life expectancy. Margaret Hayden asked, the bombing and destruction of Gaza must have severely polluted the area, the ground, the air, the water. Even if people survive now, won't they succumb later to this exposure? She wonders.
That's a really good question, and I'm sure. And we have evidence from different cohorts and populations who have survived these kind of bombing campaigns, and we've seen the increase in cancers, in birth defects, life expectancy, which already in Gaza has been decreased immensely, but long term, absolutely, it's going to have an effect. And what does the cleanup look like?
Yeah.
How long will that take? If that's even going to be an option in the future, I don't even know.
Well, Donald Trump wants to make it a beachfront property, so maybe he'll do the cleanup. I mean, the whole thing is absurd. An anonymous subscriber watching asks, Nick, how do you perform surgery on children without anesthesia? We've had reports of doctors. I interviewed Dr. Feroz Sidwa and Dr. Mal Perlmutter a few months ago, and they were talking about how they've had to do operations without basic equipment, basic painkillers. How do you operate in a place like that? You're a consultant at Oxford University Hospitals, some of the best hospitals in the Western world. How do you turn up at NASA and operate on children, on adults, without the kind of equipment you're normally used to?
It's very challenging. We never had to operate without any anesthetic at all, but our anesthetic colleagues were often using much lower dosages of anesthetics because they're in such short supply. We had many, many days when we had no pain relief to give to patients at all. So procedures we did in the ER was no pain relief at all. But operating in the operating theatre, particularly on the children, with very limited instruments. There was one beautiful girl called Habiba, an 11-year-old girl who had a terrible chest injury, and the shrapnel had shattered her lower esophagus. That's the main part of the body I operate on in Oxford. And I spent the whole of one night trying to reconstruct her esophagus without any of the normal instruments we would use. They had very limited instruments, very limited sort of suture materials, and it was extremely challenging. But you make do with what you have, and it's very rare that the lack of instrumentation or whatever is the reason they don't survive. They don't survive because of the nutrition, because of all the other things we've talked about. But it makes it much more challenging.
And Nick, just listening to you speak, listen to both of you speak about what you saw and what you did. I have to ask this question it's a question I have all the time. Iftikhar Saraf asked the question, has the trauma and the starving of children that you've seen had any effect on your mental well-being? Are you able to sleep? Will you be going back in if you get a chance to go back in? He asks.
I think, I mean, the answer to the last question is absolutely. I'm sure I'll speak for Amber and all the other doctors go there. We all have this amazing draw to Gaza. As I said, I've been going for 15 years. I've got some wonderful friends, people I'd call family there. So absolutely, I'll be going back in if allowed. I think it would be, I cannot imagine people not being emotionally affected by what they see there. I think as a doctor, you learn to compartmentalize these emotions so that when you're there doing the job, you do get on with it. It can be very upsetting when you get back to the accommodation area and talk to your colleagues, and everyone shared some really tragic stories, but you do manage to get on with it. I've found from my previous trips that the real emotional toll declares itself several weeks later once you're at home, and we all, I guess, develop strategies how to deal with that. But listen, we're out there for a few weeks at a time. Yeah. Our Gazan friends and colleagues have been going through this for 22 months. They are all destroyed physically, mentally. Yeah. They will all have profound sort of psychological problems And I spoke to some of my close friends about that, and they suffer all the time.
Umbreen?
Yeah, I want to echo what Nick said. I mean, it was my first time, but immediately I knew that I would want to go back. I think that there is sadness, it's bittersweet leaving, and there's certainly guilt when you leave. I have tried to get information and see what I could follow up as far as patients, who I could follow up on. There were definitely ones that I was very concerned about. And sorry. um, just trying to, once you leave, you never really leave, because we left people who were intubated in the ICU. I had one patient who was pregnant, but also had explosive injuries from a bomb when she was sleeping with her husband. Her husband was killed immediately, and she came in with burns covering, 30 to 40% of her body, intestinal injuries, broken legs, lost eyesight, and was intubated because of inhalation injuries. And I was asked to come in and do an ultrasound because she happened to be 5 months pregnant. So I could tell, because she was a little bit awake at this time, that she was watching while I was doing the scan, and it looked like she would do okay, and they would be able to extubate her and take the tube out, and then she would be able to recover. And every day I would go in and just check on her, and she just seemed to get worse and worse. And I found out I got back last week, but I find out the day after I got back that she had passed away. So, this definitely stays with us. You think about your healthcare worker colleagues. I think about, the head of my department and my OBGYN colleagues, as well as the ones that I met in the general operating rooms, and the skill and absolute hearts that people bring every single day to take care of people. And then they go home again. Like I said, these are, our colleagues go home to tents where everybody's been displaced multiple times, with children, families, some taking care of their elderly parents also in these accommodations, these tents, wondering about whether or not they will make it to the morning, wondering how they're going to find food to feed their family when they go home. And every morning we saw, again, they have to come in on these public buses through a safe zone. And I would watch people get off the bus wondering will I see the ones that I saw yesterday? Did they make it through the night? So yeah, I think it definitely stays with you, and leaving is very hard, and you want to go back.
I hope you're able to, because obviously they need people like you. Miriam Molson asks Umbreen, we often hear numbers for those who have died, but I don't hear numbers about how many people have survived with debilitating injuries and the impact on their daily life. Are there statistics for those who have lost their limbs or mobility or face ongoing medical problems? It is true, isn't it, that we hear a lot about the death toll, but that's just the number, that's the number of people who've died. But there's a vastly bigger number of people who are now having to live with their injuries. We hear about child amputees, but it's not just amputations, if I can again use the word just. People are living, you must have seen many people whose lives you saved, thankfully, but they're never going to live a normal life again.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have numbers that we know that children over 10 a day are made into amputees. I don't know what the number is for adults, but I'm sure it's pretty remarkable. Absolutely, for every death, there must be many more who have debilitating injuries. And if it's not an amputation, and if it's not a physical injury, I can only imagine the traumatic psychological injury that not only that affects everybody that lives in Gaza. Nobody is spared in Gaza. No place is safe in Gaza. And I know for me, I knew that when I went there, what the situation was on the ground. But when I have talked to people, I had to kind of reinforce that no one can leave Gaza. You cannot leave by air. You cannot leave by sea. You cannot leave by land. And I just want to ensure that people understand what the situation is. So it's different than, where I've worked in other places where you can find refuge either in a safe part of the country, like Ukraine, or you can cross the border and leave. And in Gaza, this is not possible.
Nick, when you hear the Gaza Health Ministry say 60,000 dead, and then you hear people in the West or people in Israel saying, oh, that number is a lie, it's a Hamas number, it's an exaggeration. Is it the case, and with your experience from the multiple trips you've made there since October the 7th and previous trips to Gaza, isn't that number higher, much higher than 60,000?
Absolutely, Mehdi. I mean, it's a gross underestimate. There are many thousands whose bodies have never been discovered, are lying dead under the rubble, including good friends of mine I know who've been dead and buried, and they've never been discovered. So that number has been estimated to, and these are deaths directly from trauma, probably to be 40% higher than that. But that doesn't take into account the excess deaths, the deaths from not cancer, non-communicable diseases, communicable diseases. There are 350,000 people in Gaza with chronic diseases which are not being treated adequately. There's over 10,000 people with cancer. There's more than 2,000 every year being diagnosed with cancer. They're not being diagnosed at the moment. And the Lancet Medical Journal has estimated that there's probably 220,000 people, including the trauma deaths and the excess deaths. That's 10% of the Gazan population, which has effectively been killed by this Israeli military assault. So, yeah, the Israelis are wrong. Those figures from the Ministry of are inaccurate. The figures are much, much worse than that.
Indeed, they are much worse. I'm glad you've clarified that for us. Kevin Brand says, to both of you doctors, a heartfelt thank you for your humanity and your steadfast efforts in such tragic times. Have you lost your faith, he asks, in your respective governments and their shocking indifference to the horror that you're witnessing? What kind of reception from your professional colleagues did you receive when you returned home? Nick, do you want to take the government question? I know you've been trying to reach out to the British government, to Starmer and co. What's the reaction been like in the UK?
I'm appalled by the inaction of the lack of any action from our government. And Amberine was talking about all the emotions we go through when leaving, and I'd echo all of that. There is some relief at going home, but you're very, very low and depressed saying goodbye to everyone. You feel guilty. But I have a really, really significant anger at our government and what they have failed to do. I think 2 days after I got back, I was watching David Lammy at the United Nations in New York, standing up and saying he felt the hands of history on his shoulders as he was talking about Britain recognizing the state of Palestine, and then, of course, applying these bizarre conditions to it. So I think our government, one might argue there's been slightly stronger words in the last few weeks, but they're, to me, utterly worthless. They're still providing arms to Israel. They're still flying reconnaissance flights over Gaza every day. They failed to recognize the authority of the ICC, the ICJ. I could go on and on. Yeah. They're failing. They're carrying on with their trade deals. So our government, these words are meaningless to me. They need to take action. They've singularly failed to do so.
Well said. Amreen, do you want to deal with the second half of Kevin's question, which is a reception from your colleagues? Because I spoke to Dr. Yasser Khan, ophthalmologist who went out to Gaza from Canada. I spoke to him a few weeks ago on stage in Toronto. And he said a lot of his colleagues, there's one colleague that doesn't believe him, thinks came back and criticized him in front of their mutual colleagues in the hospital, saying, well, you're just pushing your narrative. You are an eyewitness to a genocide. You're now back in the US. What's the reaction you're getting or you expect to get from your mainstream colleagues?
I think I have a little bit of a different situation because my colleagues are all around the world. So I have colleagues in very different parts of the world. So I think that I didn't really have to deal with American medical colleagues as much. And it's probably for the best because the American medical establishment, along with our government, has been truly disappointing in their response, in their willingness to criticize and speak out against the targeting of healthcare workers in Gaza, our colleagues in Gaza. So, none of the medical institutions, except for maybe the American College of OBGYN, which did put out a statement not too long ago about the targeting of healthcare workers and about the systematic dismantling of the healthcare system, especially maternal care. But beyond that, none of my professional organizations have said anything despite being asked. And recently, I feel like many of us sort of said, well, we're not going to hear anything from people like the American Medical Association. We don't expect to hear anything. And if we do, it's a little too late. So we've kind of moved on from that. But as far as my international colleagues, they've been great.
Nick, I'm going to use the phrase a little too late in the context of reactions. Let's apply that to the entire humanitarian situation itself. Josephine Nguyen, I hope I'm pronouncing her name right, says, what are the long-term effects of this intentional starvation campaign? How long will it take to restore health to the people in Gaza? Nick, I'm not a doctor. My mother's a doctor, but I know nothing about healthcare. I'm reading in newspapers, magazines from various people that it may be too late for a lot of people in Gaza. Even if we were to flood aid in there tomorrow, you mentioned earlier when you're malnourished, the body starts, explain to us whether it is too late for a lot of these people.
For many of them, I mean, if they opened the gates in Rafah and had unlimited aid coming in from tomorrow, there would still be many thousands of people dying from malnutrition. So for some of them, they are so malnourished that food won't help them. They need acute medical care. If you feed them, they may even get worse because they can develop something called refeeding syndrome, which can cause serious illnesses. So they need acute medical inpatient care. And of course, there aren't enough beds for all of those. So it's severe malnutrition. The organs start failing in the body. The terrible chemical imbalances in the blood. They need acute emergency medical care. So there will be, as I said, even if unlimited aid went in tomorrow, which of course we need, there would still be many deaths from malnutrition.
Deeply depressing. We are wrapping up. We're running out of time. We have got a lot of questions on the same subject. So I'm going to paraphrase a question I see from at least 6-7 people here in the chat who are asking both of you, and you can answer this in your own way, Abdul Latif Charafi, and a bunch of people here. Sorry if I'm not, Johan Beganda. A bunch of people asking, basically, what can we do? We're listening to you. They're saying, we're listening to you in the chat. Is there anything we can do? What should we be advocating for? Are there organizations we should be supporting or donating to support your work? What do you say to them? Umbreen and then Nick.
I think what I heard from my Gazan colleagues and patients and people in Gaza, and I agree with, is that we really have to speak out even more. I know at times it seems almost futile, but with more and more people now becoming aware and becoming more open to learning more about what the situation is, I do not know exactly how, especially in America, the psyche works, the worldwide psyche works, and what it was about the starvation issue that really brought more people awareness of the general picture of what was happening in Gaza, willing to listen to a little bit more about how the acute starvation is horrible, yes, but it is exacerbating a chronic starvation. And all of this, goes back more before October 2023 and what is the history, et cetera, et cetera. But I think that the more people are willing to learn, whatever the gateway is, to pressure our representatives, to pressure the American government. As an American, I can say, there are a lot of social issues that we don't seem to have money for. And I feel like if people knew that their taxpayer money was going to the bullets that are used at these GHF sites to shoot young boys in the testicles, to the bombs that are being dropped on newlywed couples in tents that are brought in with horrible injuries and amputations, shrapnel wounds and amputated, and abdominal injuries. Just now our government just committed another $30 million to this Gaza humanitarian fund, which we call also the killing fields, that money is being donated to a failed food distribution system. And I feel like the more people are now willing to hear, the more they'll be willing to speak up. And I think that's one of the strongest things we can do. As far as on the ground, groups have been doing amazing work, larger organizations. But right now, if there's a blockade in getting aid in, World Central Kitchen ran out of food while we were there a week before we left. So getting aid to mutual aid groups, Gaza and Palestinian groups on the ground. There are several that have been vetted. I met with a few representatives when I was in the hospital that were able to deliver baby formula. And that's what I would say right now would be the most effective way, is to get money to the ground to people who can buy food that is, although exorbitantly expensive, but at least available, because right now the borders are still closed.
Yeah, and there's no sign that they're going to open them anytime soon. Nick, do you want to deal with that question as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot that people can do. As you said at the beginning of this program, Mehdi, that there are no journalists in there at all. The only hard evidence coming out is from people like us and the many other healthcare workers. So listen to the evidence that has been presented, share that, send it as widely as possible to make people aware what's going on. I'm a great believer in the marches, the protests, the vigils. I think they do make a difference. It's very slow, but I think the change in rhetoric from our government, for example, one can argue there's no actions. It's very, very just words, but they are changing their words. And I'm sure that is as a result, partly from pressure from people on the ground who are marching and protesting. Francesca Albanese talks brilliantly about the economic sanctions that we should be placing against Israel. We can all avoid using those companies, those industries that benefit Israel. And we can donate. I mean, there are some wonderful, as Amberine taught, some wonderful NGOs, some wonderful agencies. I work very closely with MAP in the UK. They're a wonderful organisation. So donate, and of course, volunteering as well. So there is a lot people can do.
Well, you two have volunteered in multiple humanitarian crises and war zones across the world. You're both telling me that despite having gone all over the world, what you've seen in Gaza is like nothing you've seen elsewhere. I do hope that sinks in. If even you two are saying that based on your own global experiences, I can't even begin to imagine how bad it actually is on the ground. I would say this as we wrap up. There's a phrase, not all heroes wear capes. When I look at you both, that comes to me. You are heroic in what you've done. We appreciate what you've done. I think I'm speaking on behalf of not just the 200 people watching in this chat or the hundreds of thousands of people who will watch this online in the coming days. But I just want to say thank you, Nick and Umbreen, for what you've done in Gaza and for coming back and telling the people of the world what is happening in Gaza. And all strength and solidarity to you both. Appreciate you both.
Thank you for asking.
Thank you.
I just want to say one thing, is that, we are not the heroes. The heroes are literally our colleagues every day in Gaza that take care of all the wounded, all the babies, all the women, all the men.
Yes.
And they are really the heroes. Every single day they show up for work and do an amazing job despite the most horrific conditions.
Well said. Thank you both, and thank you everyone for watching at home. Please do get your friends, families, colleagues, subscribe to Zeteo, support independent journalism, support what we're doing here to try and get stories out to the wider public. Appreciate you all for watching. Did you like this video? Don't forget to subscribe to this YouTube channel and turn on notifications. For exclusive content and to support our independent, unfiltered journalism, head over to Zeteo.com. Your support matters.